Thank you for joining us today. And I am so delighted to be joined by Carol Roth. Carol Roth came to my attention after this last weekend's episode of the Michael Campbell Show. And she was a guest talking about her new book, You Will Own Nothing, which is soon to be released, I think next week. And I was absolutely delighted to hear Carol on Michael Campbell's show because, well, quite frankly, I feel like you're my sister. So Carol, just thank you so much for speaking out, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here, and pleased to have a sisterhood around such important topics and ideas.
Yes, well, you are a sister with a lot of, an interesting background, a very colorful background. You're a TV personality. You're a New York Times bestselling author. I think you wrote a book called The War on Small Business. It sounds like you have, you sound like you're a reality show personality in a sense too. You've done some work with Bill Gates on a show, a Microsoft show that he had on small businesses. I mean, the list went on, and then you had clients like Microsoft and Bank of America, who now we know are strategic partners with WEF. So you have been swimming with the sharks, so to speak. And now it sounds like you've really woken up and realized the gravity of what's going on. So do you want to briefly tell us your story? Because you were immersed in kind of, I'd say, the globalist elite circles, and all of a sudden went for a deep dive and discovered we're being manipulated. That's to put it mildly, but go ahead and tell your story.
So I have a sort of an unusual background. I came from a blue collar family. Neither of my parents went to college. I somehow found my way into Wharton. My joke is that I was a year behind Elon Musk, although I didn't know him in college, and didn't really know what I wanted to do. Had a ton of debt that I needed to pay down, and my father was always like, "You can't go there and take on debt unless you can pay it down really quickly." And so I asked my friends, "Okay, so what do I do now?" And they said, well, if you like to deep dive on something, you become a management consultant. And if you have ADD, you become an investment banker because you can work on a bunch of deals at the same time. And I said, I am definitely in category B. So I went into investment banking. I started my career at a firm called Montgomery Securities, which went through multiple mergers after the repeal of key provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act in the sort of late 90s, I believe it was. And we became Nations Bank Montgomery and then Bank of America Securities, and it kind of shifted everything. But it was a really, great opportunity, great time to learn financial markets. Things were very different. I know you come from the financial industry as well, Marianne. But back in the day, like, we didn't talk about the Federal Reserve. Like, we weren't hanging on what central banks were doing and, are they going to raise interest rates 25 basis points? Like, that didn't come into the conversation. I was really focused, as I think I've always been, on wealth creation opportunities. So I worked with all different kinds of companies that you may know, things like Cheesecake Factory and Papa John's Pizza, helping them raise capital so that they could grow and expand their businesses and or do things like mergers and acquisitions and whatnot. And so that was great. And then I kind of, I've been a small business advocate. As you said, I've been a reality TV show judge. I hosted a small business show for Microsoft, who, by the way, I still work with and from time to time. Hosted a small business show for Bank of America, all of these big entities, and got dragged in through my sort of investment banking background into the political sphere when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012. He came from private equity, and they went, oh, we need somebody who can explain private equity. You know how to explain that, Carol, right? Yes, but I don't know anything about politics. Well, that's okay. You can kind of fudge that element. And that's sort of what got me interested in more things. And, started to learn, became a very big advocate for individual rights and freedoms out the more that I learned. And then, when COVID started, I think that really shifted a lot of my thought, because, if you had asked me 10 years ago about some of the things I'm talking about, I would say, yeah, it sounds like I never ruled anything out as a possibility, but it doesn't sound like a big probability. And so I think that some of the things that we've been through in the last 3 years has really shown not just what the elite would do, because I'd never sort of put anything past them, but what the public was willing to accept. And I think that was really the biggest surprise for me and has sort of shifted my perspective on the things that are happening. And, as I said, I still have friends and organizations that I think are great that may have a chairman or someone that I don't agree with what they're doing. I'd say a lot of the people within the organizations have no idea about some of the things we're talking about. Like, I'm sure we'll probably dabble into something like ESG. I've talked to not only CEOs of public companies, but people who are the ESG leaders of companies, including public companies, that have never heard of the World Economic Forum, that don't know where ESG came from, that frankly don't even know what it is, but it has become so institutionalized. And so I think as we have the discussion, it's important that we don't throw whole organizations or whole groups of people under the bus, because there's just a lot of people who don't understand the information and or are maybe just afraid for their jobs or their lives or whatnot if they speak out against things that are happening on an institutional level. So I'm very open to that, and I think as I've done my research, that was one of the things that really struck me, Marianne, is just how many people are around talking about things, either being profiteers or useful idiots, as I like to call them in the book. And, how many don't really even know foundationally what it is that they're doing.
So when you present to your cohorts, listen, the World Economic Forum has some very powerful brokers and partners, strategic partners, who are all aligning with this philosophy of you will own nothing and be happy, which fundamentally is what their goal is: strip us of our assets and control us. When you present this to them, what is their reaction? Because people have known you for a long, you've been in the business for 25 years.
Yeah.
You have some credibility. So do they look at you cross-eyed, or what do they say?
So I'm definitely known as somebody who has a lot of common sense and also who crosses T's and dots I's. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book, You Will Own Nothing, is take the conspiracy element out of it and present information in the own words of the people and the perpetrators and the actors. And I think there's various motivations, and we can get into that. But it's really hard to argue, when I have people say, well, new world order, that's a conspiracy theory. And then I come back and go, okay, well, let's look at the White House's website and let me read you Joe Biden's speech where he talks about the new world order. Let's do a Google search. And then it's like, oh, well, and then they try and go in the opposite direction. One of the things that's happened to me recently, and this is probably the first forum I'm actually talking about this outside of social media, so more information here, is that I have gotten, well, certainly over time, as I've talked about more of this, I've gotten fewer of those corporate opportunities because it becomes a little bit of a liability. But I've actually gotten censored with the book recently on two fronts. The big one is from Google and YouTube, or Alphabet, Google and YouTube, who will not run the ads for my books. We basically tried to ramp up a campaign. Every time it does that, which by the way is really slow and expensive to do because it has to learn, then they cut it off and they say, no, it's because it's an election ad. Then we go, there's nothing about an election in here. Oh, it's because it says the word freedom. Okay, well, why would freedom be bad? But it actually doesn't say the word freedom in there. And they just keep going through. And then finally we'll get somebody who'll go, okay, and yeah, the algorithm shouldn't be catching it. It's a mistake. They reinstate it. It re-goes through the learning, and then they just shut it down again. So I have not been able to use that format, which is, the irony is not lost on me, because I actually talk about this in the book, the control and how that cuts off the access to wealth creation opportunities. So that's not lost on me. And then the one that I was so surprised is that there is a major economic publisher of newsletters and the like here in the United States who chased me down for an interview. And it was a whole big to do. And they went to me and they went to my publisher and they followed back up, and then, we really want to get you. And okay, fine. So I agreed to do something. And then a couple days ago, they contacted my publisher and they said, well, it's a very well-written book. It's a good book, but we don't think the topics would be of interest to our audience. And when I go and look on their website, they're talking about the student debt issues, they're talking about the Federal Reserve, they're talking about, all of these sort of economic things, which, by the way, we could have kept the topic narrowed to that. I leave that latitude up to the interviewer because the book is so robust and covers so many topics. But all of the topics that I cover pretty much are center of the plate. My feeling is, because I throw BlackRock under the bus and the WEF over the bus and Wall Street under the bus and the Fed under the bus, that they were worried about being associated with that. And so it was very much protectionist thing. So I was really frankly annoyed, but not surprised by that. So that's another thing. And this is important for the people in the financial industry to understand, because a lot of people don't. They're myopic. They know what's good for them, but they have a very short-term thinking mentality, and it's going to create issues for them long-term, their kids, the country, all those kinds of things. So you would think we would want to have this open discussion with somebody, who's not a tinfoil hat person, who's from the industry, who understands the ins and outs, and they just apparently don't want to have that conversation.
No. So in essence, here comes a social credit score. Your social credit score is slipping as we speak, and they will come after you. So obviously you've been blacklisted at some level, and that will probably accelerate.
Yeah, and it's actually happened on my Twitter account too. This was a legacy issue from Twitter 1.0, where over the last couple of years of the ownership, I had a throttled account. It was very clear there were glitches in the account, things I could tell that it was not acting properly, to which I brought to their attention multiple times. Sometimes it would get fixed, sometimes it wouldn't. And then under Musk's ownership, which I was really excited about, because here it comes free speech, it's actually gotten worse. And so my guess is that as they fix the code, they're not finding some of this old legacy code, and it's actually making the situation worse. So I am a tiny fraction of the impressions that I had before Musk took over. And again, these social credit issues have wealth creation implications, because I can't promote my business, I can't promote my book, I can't do these things. So the social standing aspect of this not only limits the freedom of the speech, but it also has dollar issues. And that's one of the key points in the book, is that social credit, whether it's just cancel culture gets more formalized, is really a wealth attack, whether it's the social standing, whether it's trying to get you fired from your job, or whether it's actually freezing your assets, which, we saw with the Freedom Convoy in Canada, and certainly other individuals, on a case by case basis, who maybe were part of wrongthink. These are things that impact people financially. And if you can control people's livelihoods, how do they live?
Exactly. So we're seeing this escalate. I do think Elon Musk was painted as the savior for Twitter, but I've heard a lot of feedback as well. People are finding the censorship is much worse. And he talks a lot about trying to create a new WeChat, a US version of WeChat. So actually, I do think he is not in our camp, although sometimes he seems to present himself. He's a little bit contradictory, but the censorship is alive and well with Twitter. I gave up on Twitter. I was booted off 3 times. But even platforms like LinkedIn, they'll shadow ban me. If I try to post something interesting, maybe an interview I've given or an interesting article, all of a sudden people just can't see your posts. So you don't really know, you don't actually know how they're doing it, but the shadow banning is probably the more effective method that they can use, because it's not as overt, and we can't really test it. So it's frustrating to be silenced. Fortunately, I think our group is growing, and the awareness seems to be picking up. In Canada, I'm beginning to notice a little bit more uptick in interest in WEF. What's your sense in the States?
So it's funny. I feel like in many ways, because Canada has gone off the rails, I feel like even more so than the United States, that there is almost on a per capita basis more interest in what's going on from Canada than there is in the United States. Certainly what happened during COVID, I think, did wake people up at some level, some people, but there's still, there's a tenor in the political sphere in the United States where people are so focused on things that aren't important.
Mhm.
And, I'm not as focused on the WEF as I am on sort of the totality of forces, whether it be central banks, whether it be governments, whether it be the United Nations, the WEF, big business, big
Mhm.
tech, all these different things. I'm more of a holistic, I'm taking a more holistic approach to trying to fight non-ownership. So, perhaps I'm not seeing some of the specific areas there, but people are so focused on stupid things that the things that are very foundational that, once they're broken cannot be fixed, just seem to go by the wayside. And I think that's the frustrating part, but also the opportunity with writing a book like this is to empower people with that knowledge, because if you don't know where these things are coming from, it's impossible to try to fight back.
Absolutely. So I think one of the biggest thrusts of your book is the issue of private property, private ownership, and that transition from stakeholder to versus shareholder, which is the lingo that they very subtly shifted, maybe hoping no one would notice. But there is a very, very important difference. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, first,
Mhm.
obviously, both of us being in financial services, we know that wealth comes from ownership. You have to own assets that have the opportunity to retain and hopefully appreciate in value. And that's the difference between, money that you earn versus putting it to work for you in a way that, has sort of long-standing store of value. And that is wealth creation. So the idea that you have a group that would be predicting the end of private property, particularly one that's littered with the business and political elite, should raise everybody's antenna. And the fact that they tell you you're going to be happy. So there are a couple of
Mhm.
really interesting nuances. One, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Not I'll own nothing, not we'll all own nothing, but you
Mhm.
specifically. I'll
Exactly.
be over here in my mansion doing just great, but you'll own nothing. So I think that's an important nuance. And then the being happy part, they want to sell this to you. They want your buy-in to this. Because if you accept this, that this is a better outcome for your life, that you don't have to worry about anything, even, a house, which is particularly in the United States, is the largest asset on household balance sheets and is the largest driver of wealth, across demographics. But now, oh, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to call a plumber, if the toilet breaks. Wouldn't that be great if you
Mhm.
didn't have this wealth creation opportunity, and then instead you just gave that money over to, the people on Wall Street? So they really are trying to sort of create this level of buy-in that I think is, kind of extra nefarious because they want people to really kind of come to this and say, yeah, this is what I want to do with my life, and maybe have some agency so it doesn't feel like it's being as forced upon you. And then people are less, likely to resist that.
Exactly. And I do think the younger generation is to a degree buying in. You'll hear
They
them
are.
say, well, I don't need to own a car. I'll never be a homeowner, so I'm happy to rent. And they're accepting this as their reality, which is very, very alarming. Because I agree with you. If this becomes something that people voluntarily opt into, this mindset, it makes their job so much easier. Whereas our generation is going to put up a fight. We equate ownership with, and being able to pass things on to the next generation. That's key in our planning.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, if they abandon that dream, they are perfect candidates for this control grid.
They are being, fed and controlled that this is the way that
This
life
is
goes. And we're seeing that fewer young people are even getting their driver's license because, oh, I can take Uber or, public transportation or whatnot. It's part of their lives. And listen, there's something to be said about, a car is a depreciating asset. So in a way, I understand it,
Mhm.
but there's also a tie to freedom there. And
That's right.
depending on where you live, you have to kind of think through the implications. The housing situation bothers me even more,
Mhm.
because of how important it is to preserving wealth. And I do think for young people, that because the opportunities, and I know it's worse actually in Canada than it is here in the United States in terms of affordability versus income, but young people don't think that they can buy a house. And the reality is that if you're knowing that you're going to fail at something, you're going to put up that shield and just kind of say, well, it's not something that I want anyway. It kind of shields you from that failure or that rejection. And so it becomes sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy because they don't feel that that's something that is attainable for them. And it's a really scary proposition. I was having a conversation earlier with some folks about the concept of sovereignty and housing. And one of the points that I made was that, just like everything else that you rent, that now if you rent a house and that becomes tied into social credit, well, you say the wrong thing, you do the wrong thing, then you don't have housing. So, it's not just your Twitter accounts taken away. Like, what if your home is taken away? In addition to the implications of giving your money and transferring it from you to Wall Street, all kinds of things that are challenging. And of course, there are times when it doesn't make sense to own things, and subscriptions are great, but things have shifted. And I think that it's just important to understand the perspective, the intentions, the plans, that if you're giving up something, even voluntarily, what that may mean as global financial stakes shift.
Absolutely. Now in Canada, how they're facilitating this, and it is global, but I really see it in Canada, the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, the other institutional investors, are swallowing up about 25% of residential real estate. And you can see what they're doing. They're buying up our residential real estate and then turning around and becoming the landlords.
Yeah.
So this, and driving up the prices, making it unaffordable for the typical Canadians. And it's so alarming. In my personal opinion, institutions should not be allowed to buy residential real estate. They should be banned. Residential real estate should be for families, for real people. But this is one of their favorite asset classes. And it's very insidious because they are the drivers behind the inflation of homes.
So here in the United States, and I do have actually one of the charts on the affordability between the US and Canada in the book, but a lot of the focus is around the United States and the data there. So before 2010, before the kind of tail end of the Great Recession financial crisis, there was no meaningful institutional capital in the single family home market. The era that we've had of 15 years of central banks just completely interfering and disrupting risk in the market, zero interest rate policy for 9 out of those 15 years was incredibly, not only disruptive, but just a huge mechanism for transferring wealth to the elite. And I always laughed at the people who said that there was no inflation, in the years before COVID. Of course there was inflation. It was all in the assets, and it was all benefiting the wealthy and well-connected at the expense of the savers and the retirees and the people who wanted to retire. But we don't view the technical information that way so that they can spin their narrative. So there wasn't the capital. When they had this access to easy money, they had all of these different places they were looking for yields. They ran out of places. And so that sort of put the lens on single family homes. And, where you said it's about 25% in Canada, it's about 1 in 5, which is, a little bit over 20%, about 22% at the end of 2022 here in the United States. And like I said, it's an insane situation. Now, I'm a little bit more of a free marketeer, so I wouldn't necessarily restrict corporate investment, because I know there are moms and pops and there are people who need to rent homes and whatnot. We need to have some access to the market, but you might want to put some restrictions in place. And I know in the United States there are housing associations and the like, but from an individual standpoint, again, be cognizant. Do you want to sell your house to a corporate buyer who are buying up tens of thousands of houses? There's one publicly traded company, Tricon, that's actually from Canada, that's buying up in the United States. So it's not even a US based company, it's a Canadian based company. And it is they're helping to inflate those costs. Obviously, the government policy is creating a lot of barriers to houses being built and lowering the cost and increasing the supply and things like that as well. And then in the US, we have a double whammy for young people, because they also have predatory college debt that is been nationalized by the government and created a huge transfer of wealth from young people to colleges and their administrators. So you're getting it on both sides, but that is the wealth driver. And so for the idea that these companies are going to rent you the American dream, even if there is no social credit component, just the idea that you are stealing that major driver of wealth creation, I think is enough for people to be up in arms about this.
Yeah. So is your prediction that these companies who are dominating on the purchase side will drive up the prices so extremely that it's unaffordable for most, and then we see an unraveling of the real estate market, and then they'll really go shopping for pennies on the dollar? Do you think we're going to see that? It's hard to predict, but
it is hard to predict. Yeah, the challenge too is that there's such a bifurcation in the real estate market, and I think that's one of the things you have to understand with You Will Own Nothing is it's really not so much about the elite, that the high level of the market, I think, is going to continue to be fine. There's some different forces in the US that I think in the short term may make things a little bit more affordable, but then probably shift it. But certainly, if you have a very well-funded organization with lots of access to capital that doesn't need to look at a home, right? Because they're not emotionally tied to it. They don't care what it's like. They're not going to live there or raise their kids, and they're getting this financial benefit from it. And you get more and more companies that are coming in, and we know Wall Street, they need to grow, they need to expand, so they need to constantly be buying more, and or charging more rent. And so I do think there gets to a point where you're just going to see, hey, this whole neighborhood is corporatized, and it's going to be at the expense of the middle class. And there's also, just kind of what does that do to a neighborhood perspective? Because when you don't have ownership, you don't have the care that goes with taking care of something that you have a financial stake in, which I think was actually a question that in our whole big talk here, didn't really talk about the shareholder versus the stakeholder. The idea of stakeholders, which is nonsense, actually was started by Klaus Schwab in 1971, at the time that he created the predecessor to the World Economic Forum, which was the European Management Forum. And he, give him credit for this, he is a persistent man, right? He's been knocking this idea since 1971, repackaging it, renaming it. And it really does stand at odds with ownership at its core. And this is why it's like, I feel like when he says, oh, this prediction isn't, part of who we are. Of course it is. Like, this is where you started from. The idea, stakeholder, is like a made up concept that can be changed based on the whims of, whoever's talking about it. Oh, I have, I'm a stakeholder of the business. What does that mean? I don't, like, if you live next door, how are you a stakeholder of my business? You're not doing anything. It's very different than I'm a shareholder. I have an ownership. I have skin in the game. I've either invested my time to get that ownership, and my work and my blood and my sweat and my tears, or I have invested my capital. And so we have made this exchange. So I have an ownership stake, and that I am a real stakeholder as a shareholder of the business and the changes. Certainly, I would say employees are stakeholders of the business, but they have a pretty concrete arrangement. Some guy who's crying about, a climate catastrophe that doesn't exist while he's flying his private jet and living in a mansion on waterfront property is not a stakeholder. And the idea is to conflate those items so that you forget about the ownership piece, and everyone can claim that there is some importance. but it's just not the same. Just as it's not the same when if you rent a car, you're going to beat it up and take care of it very differently than if it's yours. If you rent a house, you're not going to be as incentivized to invest in it and make sure that everything is taken care of the same way as if you own it. It's just a different level of having skin in the game.
So this has been kind of a foundational item in this Build Back Better that you heard it with Biden. Right. We heard it with Trudeau.
Right.
We heard it across Europe. Did it surprise you that when we were all around the world hearing the same language, Build Back Better, did that not, I found it curious that more people did not say, hey, what? Say what? Like, since when do we globally all buy into the same peculiar philosophy? Did that not, are you surprised that more people didn't see that as a massive red flag?
I am, obviously I always kind of go by the rule that, like, if it happens twice, maybe it's a coincidence. I can give you 3 times, like by the 6th time, it's not a coincidence anymore. This is, a coordinated effort. And that's why I always laugh about conspiracy theories, where a lot of times I'll be like, well, it may be a conspiracy, but it's not a theory. And I'm not the one doing the conspiring here. But we have seen the behaviors, we've seen, not only the slogans, but this global tax that the United States decided to float. Like, when has that ever been a thing that we're all going to like get together and come up with, some sort of a coordinated taxation? The fact that the G7 put out, their principles for retail facing CBDCs together. I mean, there is a lot of coordination on things that theoretically should be, very distinct and disparate, based on the particular country and, the people who are putting out their own footprint and their own ideas. Yeah. And the fact that you keep getting these similar ideas and the alignment should be very, very troubling. And I wrote a paper. I work with a company here in the US called Goldline and do an economic newsletter. And I made a comment, and again, from a US perspective, so apologies to my Canadian friends and you. We think that we're pretty great over here, or at least used to be. And we foot a lot of the bills for things that happen around the world and with our alliances. And I sort of compared our alliances to, paper tigers, that basically you have a lot, particularly in Europe, of these aging countries that have, their own slew of issues that are making really stupid ideas, and they're kind of trading off their glory days instead of the reality of what they stand for now. And in a sense, are almost more of a liability than they are, a good ally for the United States. Yet we seem to be kowtowing to a lot of the same ideals. And, again, as I research things for the book, you do see the same names and the same ideas coming up in lots of different places from a similar group of people. And it's just very difficult to find that to be pure coincidence.
Yeah. So when you have Pope Francis and you have Prince Charles, now King Charles, and you have all the heads of state talking in unison, and any of the leaders that don't talk in unison mysteriously die, like the 4 or 5 leaders in Africa, you go, oh, wait a minute, how is this so coordinated? It's quite remarkable. They're organized.
Yeah, so I'm not that far into it. I don't know about different people who've passed or been disappeared. I just focus on the forward-facing information. Yeah. And, this, at that level, I can see the coordination. And I think it would be very hard for somebody to say, this just happened just, randomly. It's just, they all went into the AI generator and they all just happened to get, Build Back Better or these ideas. They're coming from somewhere. And by the way, it's the same people over and over again.
And the New World Order language, I find that to be quite disturbing, but they don't seem to mind talking about the New World Order as though, hey, here's a good idea.
This is my favorite. This is my favorite non-conspiracy theory, because
it's remarkable.
I mean, so one of the things that I've done to take the conspiracy out of it is that, So I don't know where it got to be a conspiratorial thing, but it's just a reality. Like the US has been the center of the global financial universe for about 80 years. But before us, it was the British, and before the British, it was the Dutch. So this is just facts. This is like that changes. I mean, you could come up with a different name if you find New World Order to be, too conspiratorial. But that's just a fact. And there are a lot of, very smart people. Ray Dalio talks about this, hedge fund manager, in his books. And there's nothing conspiratorial. Everybody should know that. And everybody can see kind of where the US has shifted to a very non-sustainable, financial trajectory, and how there's a focus on de-dollarization. I mean, these are things that are in the news every day. So it should surprise everyone. What's funny is I get people, and then I start talking about how there's going to be a new financial world order. And people are like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. And then I go, okay, go to Google and type in Joe Biden, New World Order. And then you can go see all the speeches, including to the Business Roundtable on March 21st of 2022, which is on the White House website right now, where he literally talks about the New World Order in that term. So this isn't something that's being hidden, nor should it be a surprise. And going back to the WEF, this is funny too. When you look at the top 8 predictions for 2023, everybody focuses on the first one. Well, do you know what the number 2 prediction is? Because nobody focused on it. The world will no longer be the world's leading superpower. That's the number 2 prediction behind you will own nothing. So the idea, and then they quantify it like they do with everything else, that something like that there will be several countries that will be at the helm. It's not clear if the US, they're saying would be one of them, but they're going to basically talking about a multipolar world order instead of just one superpower. And, nobody gets past that first one and be like, well, this one here is just as bad and interesting and foots in with all these other things that we're talking about. So from a non-conspiratorial standpoint, you have these people who are wealthy and well-connected who are talking about it. It's on the White House's website. Like, I can't possibly think of what is the conspiracy theory? Like, what is it that you think is tinfoil hat about when I'm showing you directly, here's where that information came from?
Exactly. Well, we have a lot of movement in Canada with the UN, kind of falling under the UN.
The worst.
Yes, and my sense is that's the end game here. They would like the UN to be at the helm. And you hear of the Bank of International Settlements, that Mexican fellow, talk about, we're going to have a one world government. We're going to have one world currency that will be centrally, digitally controlled. And he goes on and on about how the surveillance will be fabulous. And I think this is the head of the Bank of International Settlements, which is the bank of central bankers.
Central banks,
This is not conspiracy. He came right out and said it. So this is, I think, the rub for me is that people are so quick to say, well, that's conspiracy. Spend 1 minute and go look for it. It's there. But the people really don't want this to be true. It's very upsetting.
Sure.
But it also, when you look inward and think, oh my goodness, the direction that we're headed here, it necessitates some action because we're heading down a very dark path.
Well, and what I would say is that even if you don't think it's a probability, because there are a lot of things that are uttered at UN and other places that never come to fruition. They sign accords and agreements. So maybe you go, it's a possibility, but I don't necessarily think it's a probability. If it's a possibility with a high cost outcome, then what do? It's the same thing you would do about fire insurance for your house, right? That's the same thing. You don't think your house is going to burn down. Most people's homes don't burn down, but you get insurance in case you're the one whose house burns down. It's the same thing here. Even if you think it's a remote possibility, it's still incumbent upon you. The stakes, the shift are so intense, and it's such a high cost scenario that it behooves you to say, well, I've at least thought about it. and I've planned for it and I've done something, and I understand that, maybe this doesn't come to fruition, or it comes into fruition in a different way that isn't as drastic, but just in case, I've made a plan for that.
Yeah,
And I think, we're financial services people. You diversify, you hedge, you don't know what's going to happen and you don't know when. So you just make sure that you've covered your bases. And I think that's, again, my message. I'm not forcing anyone to take in whatever piece of this they don't want to take. But in the back of your mind, if you go, well, it's not completely out of the realm of possibility, and I do worry about these kinds of things. Okay, we'll take that, and then let's take some action on that.
That's right. Unfortunately, the people in our industry are not allowed to talk like us.
No.
I'm independent, but if I were with my former company, Scotia McLeod or Nesbitt Burns, I would be fired the same day to be talking about any of this, because of course you're supposed to talk about the balanced portfolio, the stocks, the bonds. I don't like those asset classes right now. I wouldn't be comfortable in them. So, it's so, I think that the people in the industry who are at the front face and advising, at least in Canada, advising investors, are steering them in a very dangerous direction. They're dismissing any of this, and no brokers are speaking out. No actively employed brokers with major firms have the ability to speak the truth.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I do think things like stocks are part of the diversification from my perspective. And this is not financial advice. This is just, my own personal opinion, because I like to do what the elite are doing. I think that they are going to set things up for them to benefit. And so if they are going into certain areas, certain stocks, the broader markets, and they're going to use the central banks to support that, then I have, some level of comfort that, that may backfire on them, but that might be a good thing. And because we don't know duration, it could be 20 years before any of this materializes, and I don't want to miss out. So that's why I look at more of a diversified thing. But I will tell you that as somebody who's talked about this, in the US and in certain, media circles, the number one question that people email me about is, I need a financial service advisor who doesn't dismiss me when I talk about these things. And, we have here in the United States, there are not a lot of brokers, because it's, for the ones who have assets under management, it's outside of their fee, who won't talk about physical gold and silver and other metals. And so, they won't talk about things that, frankly, they don't even know about, some of these things that we're talking about. They won't talk about ESG, they don't talk about any of these things. And it's frustrating to the people who want to protect themselves, because they don't have qualified experts to be able to turn to that will at least go, hey, maybe I don't necessarily get it, but I understand your concern. And if you're looking to protect against this, here's how we're going to approach
exactly.
that.
Validate their concerns. I do consultations every day with clients who reach out to me and say, I'd like a consultation to talk about my investments, because I'm really worried, deeply worried. And my advisor is dismissing me and suggesting that I might be off my rocker, but I'm worried, and this is their life savings. So I am so delighted to step in and give the other opinion. I was in that industry for so long. I know all about portfolio structure and balanced portfolios. And I agree with you, diversification is everything, but there are some asset classes, especially bonds, I'm particularly worried about. In the stock market, yes, maybe in the commodity sectors, commodities I think will fare well. That's my favorite.
I mean, if the thesis we're talking about happens soon, commodities have to fare well.
Commodities, but I'd rather be working with in a certain way with commodities as opposed to in the stock market. But I think hard assets, the gold, the silver, land.
That's
it.
This is chapter 11, and it talks about, when you talk about land, look what the wealthy people are buying. They're buying up land. They're buying up water rights associated with land. They think this is going to be a good investment, or they want to get their hands on that investment.
That absolutely is one of their
land
top
that is productive, things that can be farmed, things that have timber, water, whatever it is. And so so that is a big piece of the last chapter here of talking about putting things into a form factor that's real and tangible, that you can control as part of your diversified portfolio strategy.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you know, but we are spending a good part of the year now in Costa Rica. We bought a big ranch. We're self-sufficient. Well,
nice.
Interestingly, when I speak to realtors down in Costa Rica and I say, how are things going? They say, well, we have unlimited demand for big property. Well, in fact, Trudeau just bought an $18 million place.
Interesting.
There are an inordinate number of elite with their private jets and their yachts clustering in Costa Rica, buying massive off-grid properties. Well, why are they there? So I like to study what the elite are doing, because I think, look at what they're doing and you copy it.
Exactly. Don't listen to what they tell you. Look at what they're doing.
What are they doing? They're not driving electric cars either.
No.
Like at the WEF meeting, in January, none of them wanted their drivers to be driving electric cars because they said they're not reliable in the cold weather. And none of the, at the WEF meeting as well, none of their pilots were allowed to be vaccinated. So this is bizarre that people don't make it a study to watch them carefully. I think we should be copying them. They are a perfect model of what we should be doing right now.
100%.
It's fascinating to me that because they are so hypocritical. It's not, and then I look at the likes of Mark Carney, who is a big figure here in Canada. He headed the bank in England for a while, the central bank. But he
by the way, his resume, the amount of things that he's done,
it's remarkable. He's a very smart man, and I think he's the brains behind Trudeau. But he cut off our oil and gas sector in Canada. But then he was asked about his Brooksfield management, which he's the major player. One of their top holdings is oil and gas in Brazil. So look at what they're doing. Don't listen to what they say, because they're hypocrites. And we are the commoners. We're the peasants. And I think we've really got to wrap our head around that fact. We are not one of them.
It's the thesis. It's the you will own nothing, not me. Well, I need to do this because I know better, and so I need to be able to tell you all these things, and so it's okay for me, but really everybody else shouldn't do that. That's a huge red flag. We had John Kerry, who is the climate envoy and supreme idiot of the United States, in testifying before Congress, and it was just so ridiculous. Congress actually did a really good job of putting him in his place, but just the nuance of he kept saying oh, I don't own a private jet. And it's okay, but your wife's company does, and you fly it. Are you really gonna? And oh, by the way, you're a shareholder of the company. Is that really a distinction of you don't own the private jet because you have an LLC around it and you only have it's just insanity. And yes, we've recorded the number of times that you've flown around and all that kind of stuff. So the idea that they're telling you that the world is going to end and that there's a climate catastrophe and that nobody is acting with any sense of urgency, people just need to pierce that veneer and just say, okay, yes, I want to be a good steward of the planet, but the way that they're the conspiracy theorists. They're the ones that are pushing this insanity and the insane approach and doing things that are very destructive to, as my friend Alex Epstein likes to say, to human flourishing.
Yeah. It's another irony is they're the biggest buyers of waterfront property in the tropics. Well, if you believe in global warming and you believe in rising sea levels, you're not buying waterfront. So they're telling everyone global warming rising, and then they go and pick up the property at a discount.
Amazing.
It's
amazing.
Remarkable. It's
amazing.
And it's so obvious what they're doing. They're not even discreet about it. They just merrily go on their way. But people somehow, I don't think, are watching them closely enough to see what exactly they're up to. They're believing the narrative. They're believing the social media that they own, or not social media, the legacy media that they own, which is, so let's talk a little bit about the players here. It's the government, central bankers, big tech, media. What do you think of this whole coordinated effort? How do you think they've been so effective here?
So I broke it down into sort of three groups. I've got what I call the government related, which is government and central banks, the bad actors, the WF, the UN, big businesses, whatnot, and then big tech, which I think is a thing in and of itself. And the reality is, I think they each have their own objectives, and sometimes they work solo, but sometimes it benefits them to work together. And my philosophy, and this is just a best guess based on my research. So there's stuff that I have that's, super tightly researched. And then when you start getting into motivations, this is just my best guess. So when people ask me if this is intentional, I like to say that I don't know if it's intentional, but I think it's deliberate. And the deliberateness is that as financial stakes shift and they want to set themselves out on top, that sometimes things get sacrificed. So I don't think there's a group, and you may differ from this perspective, but this is just my perspective. I don't think that there's a group that's going, we have to kill freedoms, we have to take everybody's property, we need them to be subservient, blah, blah, blah. What I think is Lord, like, we put ourselves in a bad situation. It's going to change rapidly here. We got to hold on to like as much as we can. We've got to get everything. And in the process, if everybody else's freedoms and wealth and whatever go by the wayside, that's fine. And oh, by the way, if we get them to buy into it, it'll just be much easier for us. And I think it's an important distinction, because it's like, it's the difference between, the movie of the cabal sitting around being like, how can we be evil? Ha ha ha. Versus just basic human nature, right? You've got wealthy and powerful people. They want to hang on to their wealth and power. I don't think that there's anybody who would disagree or think that that's much of a leap. And, that they're willing to sacrifice things in the process, if it doesn't pertain to them, make you cannon fodder. I also don't think that that's much of a stretch to believe. So that's kind of, not to say that there aren't, a few nefarious players who are just crazy in the mix, but I think that's a, kind of a Occam's razor kind of approach to, the simplest answer is probably the right answer.
Well, I look at the management consulting firms, the Bains, the Boston Consulting Groups, the Ernst and Young, the big players. They are on the list. They're all seven of the big four, the big three. They're all on the list of strategic partners with WEF, and their clients are all the Fortune 500. So
they make a lot of money.
They make a lot of money.
They're the profiteers.
That's right. They're the profiteers, but they are fabulous henchmen for pushing the agenda, because they go to their clients and say, listen, this is the way, this is the new world. This is the new world order. We don't need people anymore. We're going AI. We don't really need, we want to go universal basic income, let go of people, and governments will pick up the slack with universal basic income. Minimum, I think a lot of the direction comes from the management consulting firms, which are very closely tied to WEF and, the Trilateral Commission. So I wonder the role of the management consultants in all of this, because they are advising their clients.
Listen, this is the model that I put out in the book, and I got it first from Peter Thiel. It just sort of good ideas to bad outcomes. And then I kind of tweaked it into sort of my own purposes. But when you have these ridiculous ideas, there's people who are figuring out how they can profit. And if you think about something like ESG or, any of these other crazy ideas, there's just a lot of money for them to make. And so if they're financially incentivized, and it's wide, right? It's the consultants, it's the people who, do the scoring, it's, the people who do the training, all these kinds of things. Like, it's a huge industry, and they're financially incentivized to say this is something, then, that's what's going to happen. Charlie Munger said it, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. That these are things aren't hard to do. So again, I don't know if it's that they're like going, well, we have to try to control businesses via ESG, versus like, this is a dollar bonanza, and we can just kind of convince everybody this is an important thing. And there is probably somebody up the chain who went, oh, these profiteers here are a great way to get this into corporate America. And then by the time it gets down the chain, the people don't even know. I mean, I've talked to CEOs of publicly traded companies. I've talked to ESG heads at major companies and publicly traded companies. They've never heard of the World Economic Forum. They don't know where ESG comes from. They couldn't even explain it if they tried. It's just, well, this is an important new thing, and it helps with capital, and I think it's going to help with this. they're risk managers. They don't want to be under attack. And so these ideas get entrenched, and with most of the people not having any idea what's behind them. And I think that's, what's both so scary and a little bit, dirty about it.
Yeah, it is. It's so widespread. And so the social credit system, in your interview with Michael Campbell, you were talking about how it really got implemented during the vaccine.
Yes.
Because there all of a sudden society was divided. There were two tiers of citizens, the compliers and the non-compliant, and they were treated differently. Do you see that continuing? Do you think, well, in a sense, you're suffering from it now because you in a sense, you've been blacklisted. You're being pushed off some social media channels that normally you would be able to access to put word out on your book. How far reaching do you think this social credit system is going to expand?
Oh, I think it's huge, because I think it's an outgrowth of cancel culture.
Mhm.
And the idea that there are people who feel like they can get what I call ROE, return on ego, from kind of being the people who are enforcing, the moral code, whatever, group of people dictate, that whatever they think that is. So we see it all the time. Somebody does something on video and we need to find them, and we need to call their employer and make sure that they never work again. And it's a really kind of a scary side of human nature that, that you would just see some video of a stranger and like, now I'm going to go after their livelihood. And I mean, even, criminals and people who are, have done really bad things, like when they come back out into society, like they need to earn a living. So, who gets to decide that all of a sudden you can't earn a living anymore? Like it's really fairly scary. So, we saw during COVID, people coming after you. You couldn't go into a restaurant if you weren't vaccinated, or you lost your job. They shut down businesses. As we talked about the Freedom Convoy, they seized their assets. So all different kind of levels of the social credit that were implemented to go after financial creation opportunities. And what the ruling class learned by that is, people will go along with this. Mm-hmm. Because to implement this on the state level, you need two things. One is you need technology to be able to, collect, store, analyze data at scale, which obviously we have. And then you need people who are willing to agree with you and to go to the mat that this is an important thing. And we have proven that, that happens. And, frankly, it shouldn't be a surprise, because human nature, you saw what happened, in Nazi Germany, and people turning on their neighbors and whatnot. So, history dictates that, this is probably how people are going to act. And, they showed up in that manner and acted that way. So if you're the elite and you can do these things and infringe on people's rights to affect an outcome or change, or grab power, or grab wealth, and people will go along with it, like, why would you not use that tool?
Yeah, it's proven to be very effective thus far.
Yeah.
And very sophisticated psychological warfare in a sense, because I think they've used very sophisticated methods. Yeah. This is no accident. The way that in Canada, there was a lot of guilt. There was a lot of, you're going to kill your grandmother. Sure. Or you're selfish because the collective needs you to be vaccinated.
Right. Well, and even more than that, we saw coordination. Think about what happened with the U.S. government and social media that has come out now, which, we knew was happening, but we've now actually got the documented proof, including and removing information in people's accounts at the behest of the government. So, that's a huge violation here of First Amendment rights. And I don't know who's going to be accountable for that.
You have a judge that came out on July 4th and filed an injunction against the social media companies collaborating with government. And I'm not sure of the judge's name, but I found it quite fascinating. It could change the future in the US.
I hope so.
I haven't heard much more about it, but it's a little bit of hope.
Yeah, we do. We have some people here who are trying to stand up, trying to use the system. And I think that's why, this discussion is so important. I know we're short on time here, but, I do just want to reiterate that empowering people with knowledge, and even if it all doesn't work for you, some level of it will work for you. and then knowing in taking the actions so that if these things happen to you, you think about what it is you want to do, and also just, kind of realigning principles, because it's very easy for people to go, oh, well, they're just doing that for the people who are wrong think, or well, what happens when you're on the side of wrong think? Who's deciding that? Oh, it's just the billionaires. Okay, well, it's never just the billionaires, and they have all the good lawyers. What about when it comes after you? I think people's go to knee-jerk reactions are, well, it's just this, and it's never just that. And you have to think more broadly about it.
Yes. So if you were to give a prediction here, what's your best guesstimate as to what's coming down the pipe here?
So I think that one of the things about me is that I'm very transparent. And if I don't know, I don't know. And I think I can project a good half dozen different outcomes, that other people have talked through. I can predict different durations. So much of this can shift by different geopolitical decisions. If we have a really cold winter this year, I think that changes a lot of things, because we had a really warm one last year. And so all of this push away from energy, was kind of, it didn't come to bear as a big issue, but that was a gift, not a strategy. So there's just so many little disparate things that I think can change. And it really also depends on how people react. So I'd say, like, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And have that preparation and have that diversified strategy, because we can see trajectories. I can tell you lots of different trajectories that are going on, but we don't know duration, and we don't know things that may end up changing those along the way. So the best thing you can do is be prepared for a range of outcomes. And when that situation happens, because I think if I had to go with one prediction, is that there's going to be a period of chaos, that even if things sort of reset back to normalcy, or we don't go full into sort of a new financial world order, like straight away, like there's going to be a period of chaos. There usually is, before major shifts and changes. And I think it's going to disrupt people's lives in a way that we're not used to, given the time period that we've lived through and that people take for granted. So I'd just be prepared that things in the future may not be the same as they were in the past. Hopefully the last 3 years opened your eyes to that, because we lived through a period that was unlike anything else that I've ever seen. And prepare. The elite wants you to own nothing, but I would like for you to own as much as possible.
And on a very practical level, what does that look like, though, in terms of trying to retain your ownership?
Yes.
Get rid of your debt if you can. Don't be at the mercy of a bank, or start doing some family banking with family or friends. But what are the other ideas that you, just in a very small nutshell here, what are the strategies that you think are the most important, beyond diversifying?
So it's funny, because I think that a lot of this is the advice I would give people in any scenario. It's just more important and heightened in this scenario. But it is things like looking at what the elite are doing and copying them from a financial standpoint. They are not looking to put themselves in a worse financial scenario. So have the diversification, go to the hard assets, go to the land, make sure that you have, if we go to a central bank digital currency, some small denomination precious metals that you can use to be able to barter and exchange. Talk to people in your community. Make sure that you have the person who can have the chicken with the eggs, and who's the doctor for medical needs, and all those things that you might not think of otherwise. Do some financial planning, and this is very US based. I don't know the scenario in Canada as well, but we have a ton of money that's set to turn over here in the US, nearly 85 trillion in the next 23 years. And that, I can't guarantee you that if they change, the way that they approach wealth, or they approach inheritance taxes, that you will be grandfathered in. But given then the fact that the wealthy people do estate planning and have things like trusts in place, my guess is that, if I was a betting woman, I think there's a good probability that could happen. So I'd be looking at things like that, and gifting up to the maximum, if you can, to your heirs now, so that they own that money and that's protected. So, different things that there's a whole chapter about behavioral shifts, but a lot of it's just intentional. One of the things that's really crazy, is with this book, on the pre-sales, normally you get a lot of people who are buying Kindle, and people are buying the hard copy book because they know they want to have the behavior of having to actually own something. I know someone's not going to come in and be able to change the words in here. This is going to be exactly, what she said that I can refer back to. And I think there's just an intentionality about that. It doesn't mean that you make the decision that you have to own everything when maybe something or a rental might come on something that is non-material, but it gets you in the habit of just thinking about it and making a decision and being more rational. And I think when we do things with intention, it always leads to changing the outcomes.
Well, Carol Roth, well said. I really appreciate your perspective. And I'm so glad you wrote that book. I was thinking, gosh, I've been talking on this topic for a couple of years, and it's lovely to know that you've distilled the most important elements of what's coming down the pipe in one place. And I think it serves as a wonderful gift to someone who perhaps is on the fence, because I haven't read it yet, and I guess it's released next week, right?
It is. So you can pre-order it now,
you can pre-order.
and then it'll be in people's hands next week. With Canada, I'm pretty sure it's just about the same time frame. I know that England is a little bit later, but pre-order it so that day one when it comes out, you can have it in your hands.
And I would say go to your local bookstore and try to buy it with cash. Use cash. All of these little things that we think are not that significant individually, but collectively, a lot of shop owners have said to me, everyone's using cash, and I'm thinking, yes, people are. I think the message is getting through.
Yes.
You do not want digital anything, digital identity, digital. So Carol, thank you so much for your time. I wish you every success with your new book launch, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you reaching out and this platform and talking about these things, this interesting conversation. And I hope this can further empower people and really help to fight back.
Okay, well, take care and keep up the fight.
Thanks.
Okay.